Hi everyone, welcome to week 5, I think, if I'm not wrong, in the CERIAS security seminar. So today we have with us Russell Waymeyer, who is a manager at Sandia National Laboratories, working on the area of cyber physical system, which is really close to my heart because I really like CPS. So Mr. Waymeyer has over 25 years of experience in design, implementation, testing of software and hardware systems in both IT and OT. So I will just let it to Russell. Please, Russell, take away. The talk would be on information design assurance red team, which is a assessment methodology. I think that will be really exciting for folks who work and aim to work in security. So please, Russell.
Excellent. Thank you for that introduction. Let me go ahead and just start sharing my screen here. And we can kind of get going. So yeah, as was mentioned, yeah, I'm at Sandia National Laboratories. And this talk will be on IDART, which is an information design assurance red teaming talk. So it's a little bit, it'll cover topics that involve program management, technical execution of red teaming, system security, a broad range of topics that kind of fall under the technical fields of computer science, as well as computer engineering, but also project management as well. So it's kind of how to put together good red teams and kind of thought processes that you go through when trying to do red teaming to kind of harden a system to make it a little bit more robust. So just to start off, I wanted to level set a little bit and kind of just talk quickly about, so I work at Sandia National Laboratories. So a little bit of the idea, the concept of the national laboratories. We are not-for-profit, nonprofit organizations that are under the Department of Energy. And there's 17 labs spread across the country. A lot of it came out of the Manhattan Project in the 1940s. And after that, the United States realized that it wanted to kind of create, so we essentially are government-created contractors. Essentially, we are companies that were created by the government, but managed by private sectors. But essentially, the bulk of the work that we do is on behalf of the federal government for national security, purposes of national security. So we're located out here in New Mexico. That's where I'm kind of calling from. We're just about an hour south of Los Alamos National Laboratory. So Los Alamos, which probably, I think, especially recently, has a little bit more fame. They're the ones who kind of are obviously known as kind of, that was Oppenheimer and the creation of the first atomic bomb. But after that was done, Sandia was built as an engineering laboratory. So our laboratory kind of does everything except what they call the physics package. Essentially, we're the components that surround it. And so as you go into the 1950s and 60s and mass production of nuclear weapons as a deterrent for war kind of really takes off, Sandia is the laboratory that really is tasked with kind of maintaining the nuclear stockpile. But out of those technologies, especially in the 1960s, where you would really rely on physical access control as a means for protecting the weapons from falling into the wrong hands. It started to be about that time where a lot of logical and computer and cyber kind of access control approaches started to come about. And so that was kind of the birth of cybersecurity here at Sandia Labs. It picked up again strongly, especially applying it to IT systems in the 90s as people started realizing the Wild West, the internet and everything else as it started taking off, and computers became a lot more connected globally, that you needed to have cybersecurity. And then especially in the 20s, the 2000s and the 2010s, it continues to spread to things like OT systems, operational technologies. So that kind of starts to really tie into, again, part of Sandia's mission, which is not just the nuclear weapons themselves, but being a Department of Energy lab. We're heavily involved in non-proliferation. That word basically just means trying to reduce the spread of nuclear materials, nuclear weapons, things like that, into terrorists' hands, into other nation states that is not in the United States' interest to have. And so that involves things, and throughout my career, I've been somewhat involved in this, of traveling internationally to basically try to protect, nuclear power plants abroad, protect radioisotopes. A lot of universities, I think Purdue's one of them, that has a research reactor as part of their physics department. So associated with that is radiological isotopes. So again, you're talking physical and cyber protections with facilities as well as components. But of course, a lot of this ties into IT networks, and then OT networks, the operational technology. For those of you who may not be aware of OT technology, that's essentially kind of components, computer systems that are used to monitor and control physical processes. So think pipelines, dams, nuclear power plants, naval ships, satellites, kind of you name it. If it's got a physical kind of moving actuator, circuit breaker, things like that, that's kind of those OT networks that behave very different than IT networks. So let me go ahead and just jump to the next slide. So this is kind of the monitor. So IDART has kind of been developed. It's been around for about 20 years. It's always kind of continuously being improved. And you'll see in the very last slide of the presentation, it's kind of been rebranded and kind of named CASA, which there's an open source link that you can get that's based here out of Sandia, that essentially Sandia, and part of its role as a nonprofit, is we kind of try to develop and mature up technologies that maybe industry either won't do because it's not profitable yet for them to invest in some technologies, or kind of can't do because maybe it's in a classified space. But IDART is one of these technologies that we kind of it's a methodology that we developed here at Sandia to try to do red team assessments. And essentially our job, because we're paid, it's taxpayer funding that funds these national labs. The idea is we kind of throw it out into industry and people can pick it up and use it as they like. So all of this information here is freely available. There's no products to sell or anything like that. So this is kind of just my story of the 20 years and of kind of what is the IDART assessment methodology, what's red teaming, and kind of how we found over the decades that really works to do effective red teaming. So let me go ahead and just jump right in here. Oh, sorry, it's a little bit slow to react. So topics in this presentation. This is kind of an outline of what we're going to cover here. Distinguish between red teaming and other forms of assessment. I'll describe the methodology. We'll identify elements of a red team project. That's part of that project management component of it that I was going to tell you we'd cover. There's also recognizing different forms of data collection, different ways to collect data, whether it's socially, whether it's from computer information, whether it's open source, things like that. And then we'll also be talking about developing views for characterizing systems. So a big part of it is once you have the data, how can you visualize it to try to understand where a system's strengths and weaknesses lie, things of that nature. And then also we'll kind of talk about how to accurately represent the threat in terms of a generic threat model. I'll show you kind of what some approaches that we use to try to identify how likely a threat is, and then what the mindset is associated with that, because a lot of red teaming really hinges around what the threat is. You don't have an infinite amount of resources and money to just try to protect a system, and so really you need to kind of try to identify who's trying to break in to then decide to define your defensive kind of posture of how you're going to try to prevent that. It's really important to kind of have that to prevent scope creep into a kind of idea, develop the idea that you're red teaming against a particular threat rather than just all threats. And then we'll describe specific attacks to a target system. And then kind of at the end, a lot of this kind of being a full kind of project management kind of methodology involves documenting the results, which is really important so that you can give it back to the system owners, and then they can obviously improve their system, make changes, do something with that. So kind of the goal for IDART is really trying to create red team resources. So I'll try to start kind of picking up the pace a little bit as we move through some of these slides, because I've got 80 or 85 slides, and we've only got 40, 50 minutes to kind of get through them. A lot of them are kind of single picture slides and some other concepts, but let's get going here. So red teaming, what is red teaming? It's first and foremost, it's an activity that's authorized. You're not hacking into somebody trying to break into a system where they don't know that you're doing it. It's something that's cooperative. It's adversary based. As I mentioned before, you need to have an adversary and their capabilities in mind. It's a set of assessment activities, and it's performed primarily for defensive purposes to improve the system. So there's this idea of red teaming, which is a little more kind of attack based. You're trying to attack in a system so that in the end, the system owners can then beef up their defenses. But there's blue teaming, which is primarily activities that surround solely just trying to kind of increase your defensive capabilities, whether it's forensics or trying to kind of increase or reduce your attack cross section and things like that. And then there's this idea, and this is where actually IDART falls into this a little bit, even though most of this talk will be around red teaming as the context for IDART. Really what we do in practice is what we call purple teaming, where it's half red, half blue. Essentially, we really work closely with system owners to get their network topologies, their system documentations, interview with them in a very friendly manner so that we can really essentially accelerate the timeline so we minimize the resources we put in. But it can be more reflective of maybe an adversary that has spent years, months or years trying to, through open source or insider threat, trying to kind of identify what your system defenses are. That's this idea that obscurity is not a measure or an effective means of really doing cybersecurity. So cybersecurity through obscurity is not really effective. At some point, you just have to assume that, your adversary might own kind of all of your, kind of design documentations and understand your processes well enough that you kind of can't assume that just because you try to hide stuff that somehow your design is good. So why use a red team again? It's, as I mentioned before, you're trying to reveal vulnerabilities in a system design, and you're trying to examine system security questions. There's a lot of kind of what if scenarios that can be looked at. You're trying to kind of answer the question, again, you're trying to identify and prevent that scope creep, get really a system owner to kind of understand who are you trying to protect your system from, what is their motivation and goals and knowledge, is it denial of service, is it to try to steal information, there's a lot of different kind of motivations that adversaries might have, what are their skills, what are their capabilities essentially. And then essentially we want to also be able to stress systems under adversary-like conditions, maybe in a test environment before exposing them. There's a lot of different use cases where you could apply kind of this concept of red teaming and the IDART methodology. And you really want to just use adversarial thought throughout the entire process to ensure that essentially your systems have the best chance of reducing adversarial intrusion and them meeting their goals and you being able to defeat them. So who should have had a red team? Here's just a quick slide. A couple of these are a bit older, but I kind of include them because there's also kind of continued ongoing kind of fallout from them. So I don't know how familiar people are with the Antwerp diamond heist. It happened in Antwerp up in Belgium. This was way old. This is pretty old, way back in like 2003, and it wasn't even cyber related. Essentially kind of a long-term planning, a set of 8 thieves that kind of essentially dug a tunnel in a rented building next to a bank, went underground and came up from underneath. So essentially a lot of the other security posture, security defenses that it was a jewelry store, actually, I think, the Antwerp Diamond Center, that essentially, all of their external kind of vaults and things like that from the street facing kind of access were circumvented. And then there's the Target. A lot of people kind of fall back on the Target. That was one of the first big, I include that one because there's been a lot more that are recent and even bigger ones since then, but the Target one was one of the very first ones that kind of happened, where essentially it happened kind of December 2013. And at the time, it was like $40 million in debit and credit cards. And it was essentially malware was put on a vendor's computer, an HVAC person that basically plugged into the network. And so Target actually had quite secure, they had a pretty beefy IT team for the time. And I think the numbers are like 80 to 100 people working for them that really had locked down their, point of sale, the card entry, registers, and essentially locked it down pretty well, but they didn't have their antiviral stuff necessarily on a vendor's computer. And so when he plugged into their system, the virus was able to migrate to their system, and it actually did get caught by the, I think it was FireEye software that they had, and then it alerted their IT team, but they had it configured so that essentially it didn't automatically remove the malware, which was a capability at the time. They said, no, we want a man in the loop, human in the loop, and be able to essentially kind of vet each item. And so they kind of ignored it. And so for 19 days, basically a large data cache was able to be exfiltrated. And at the time, it was like $40 million in debit and credit card credit card, the value of their the cards that then were sold on the black market. But it hurt their reputation, their sales, their seasonal sales, where they get 30 to 40% of their yearly sales come during that Christmas season. They lost like 40% of that year. And so kind of a recent estimate that I saw on Slate that was as late as that was a Slate article from 2022, put losses for this all the way up to like March 2016, up to like 291 million. So it's still growing because there's still losses. And then of course their CEO quit and there was a lot of fallout that way. So it kind of just shows that red teaming, again, it's this idea of trying to kind of make sure that you invest in these type of things, in cybersecurity. I think that's less of a hard sell these days, but it's still something where, cybersecurity is something that unfortunately, when it works well, nobody notices. So it's hard to kind of really sell its use, trying to say, well, look at all these things that didn't happen. So let's jump on to the next thing. So quickly, we'll now start to talk about the IDART methodology itself. So it really kind of involves trying to understand the threats, anticipating an adversary, trying to kind of understand their motivations, as we talked before, and then trying to identify your own weaknesses so you can kind of shore them up. So IDART actually is kind of an acronym that stands for Information Design Assurance Red Team, and the information part is that you're looking at physical and virtual systems. So this has been predominantly applied to IT systems, but also OT, the operational technology systems, because it's a methodology essentially to kind of do red team. It's independent of the technology you use. And then the design assurance part, so essentially that means that it has an emphasis on design. You can essentially look at somebody's design. So some of the systems, depending on where they are in the life cycle, this methodology can be applied where all you have is a concept on paper, and so it's being applied to the design of something. But even after you've built it, it could still be applied to the design. It's just that, as we all know, fixes later in the production process can be more costly. And there'll be slides in here that talk about kind of the nature, which I think a lot of you, if you're familiar with cybersecurity, you're probably familiar with this idea that lots of times systems are built to be functional, and then cybersecurity is kind of bolted on as an afterthought. And so the idea of design assurance, ideally you'd want to do it up at the front. People that are really cybersecurity minded tend to kind of do that, but most systems, as most of you probably would guess, 95% of them or so, this red teaming and the design assurance is oftentimes applied after the system's been put into use and you see how it works and you're realizing that you want to maybe change the design. And then red team, a lot of this is performance-based analysis. So I think this is a good time to kind of hit hard on the concept that performance, so there's different types of kind of system validations that you can use. There's like the 853 NIST publication series that's mainly geared towards, I think, government networks, but the 800 series in general, it comes out of NIST, as well as like ISO 9000 and others, are compliance-based documents. It's a list of checkboxes of, hey, do you enforce strong passwords? Do you have a rules of behavior for a system, for users that get on your network, things like that. It's very compliance-oriented. And red teaming tends to be, and especially IDART, is a lot more performance-based. It doesn't kind of care about what the regulations are and what you claim that you're taking credit for on what regulation or rule or requirement that you're satisfying, because the adversaries tend to not look at that. They look between the seams of, for example, you might have a system administrator that there's not a technical enforcement. It might be written in your documentation to have strong passwords that have to have a minimum of 14 characters. But if there's not either a system administrator or a technical enforcement in the code requiring, hey, if I try to do 5 characters, that it kicks it back at me and says, no, your password's not long enough. That's an example of where you might be okay with the compliance, but the performance-based thing would maybe show a lack of security in there. And I've got a lot of different war stories that I'll bring up from time to time about some of the experiences we've had as we've gone out and done these type of assessments at ISPs and government agencies, where essentially after doing interviews with some of the system administrators and then reviewing their documentation of how their system's supposed to be built, that's where you really do have, you're capable of finding the most nuggets of okay, an adversary might be able to kind of take advantage of this. So IDART has been applied over the last couple of decades here at Sandia, and we've tried to also share it with some industry partners and government agencies to where they can kind of build these teams and use this methodology to essentially do their own red teaming. But Sandia is kind of the developer of this and trying to kind of do the, pioneer in this area of trying to apply this methodology. It's been used in a number of different things to evaluate, like I mentioned before, developmental systems before they're put into production. We've done study adaptations and interactions, that what if scenario of what if I do technology insertion? What if I want to put a new switch into this system, into the network? How does that impact, my attack surface and kind of a vulnerability analysis type thing. It's also helped in a lot of just tabletop and whiteboarding, wargaming, kind of where you can kind of just do thought experiments to try to understand how to best design this system and what threats are really out there. Lots of times it's not just how the system's built, but obviously systems have people associated with them, and therefore that human factor is big. And then to support experimentation. So Sandia, as a lab, we tend to have a lot of master's and PhD level researchers. We're heavily, even though we're an engineering lab, it's kind of an R&D lab. We're big in the research. And so a lot of our approaches to things need to have the scientific method bring statistical and mathematical models to bear to really be able to prove out that, hey, when you put together kind of a concept or have a methodology or approach, you need to be able to kind of have the backing of kind of scientific principles, so that when you kind of publish and kind of try to use it, there's a little bit more of that formalism to it. Let's see. So here's just a few other applications of IDART. The one on this one that I wanted to really kind of talk to again at the end was that vulnerability awareness, demonstrating the impacts of exploited vulnerabilities and showing the breadth of what they are and if they're reachable. So a big part of IDART is also this kind of idea of brainstorming and red teaming. And so you build kind of these attack graphs that really help you kind of think through the process of how do I get to the flag, capture the flag? How do I, is this system that I thought was air gapped? Is it actually, kind of obtainable, or can an adversary actually get into it? Things of that nature. So here's the framework itself. If you don't take away anything else from this presentation here, this one slide right here, which you'll see again, because I have it kind of before each of the sections that I'll go through. This is the one to kind of memorize, that really has kind of, I think, the meat of the framework. So essentially, you kind of, it's a process here where you kind of start by planning, and that can be involved again in that cooperative way of kind of getting documentation from a customer or a site owner, system owner. But it's also planning with building your own teams, putting together the right set of competencies, grabbing, hey, if the system's going to have virtual machines and they're Linux versus Windows, we need to make sure we have a subject matter expert that knows that stuff. So it involves kind of identifying the scope, identifying kind of what the limits are on what your red team assessment is going to be, and putting bounds on that. And then, of course, as you can see here, it kind of goes into the wheel there in the center. There's this next idea. The next step is collecting data. And that's where you can work in partnership, but you can also pull from open source. You can pull from a number of different sources. And we'll talk about that as we go into that section. And then the next step is you try to characterize that data. So in characterizing the data, what you do is you have the data, but then what you want to do is really try to understand the data. How can you put it together, generate views, different views, some of them temporal, some of them are logical views, some of them are spatial. Hey, an example of that, of the view being helpful is, hey, where is, the actual physical layout of maybe their security closet compared to a conference room or something like that, or a visitor waiting room or something like that, depending on the facility and depending on the system. And then once you've characterized the system and you've looked at it through a number of different views, you're doing that analysis. It starts to kind of bleed into that analyze phase where you're actually doing the actual analysis. You're actually doing the brainstorming. You're walking through and trying to kind of really understand, now that I have the data, now that I've really got it in a well understood and representable fashion where my teams can sit down and look at it, what are the weaknesses? What are the gotchas? What are the areas where there's strengths? Again, that's an important part that we've really tried to make sure we incorporate into part of this methodology is to keep the strengths. Because lots of times if you just try to kind of call out the weaknesses, sometimes people will fix the weaknesses, but then open up a new one because they essentially reduced one of their strengths to kind of shore up a weakness. So it's just as important to call out those strengths that you see as well. And then essentially you can kind of go in this in a cyclical manner, that if you do some analysis and you realize we need more data, I want higher fidelity or granularity on a particular area that I don't know enough because I think there's something there, you can go back and collect data, characterize, and analyze again. And you can do all of this kind of around this idea of engaging with the system. And that could be either you're looking at a report and the report might have, network topologies and design documentation, and all you do is look at a report, or it could involve actually traveling and being on site at a facility to where you're also looking at the physical controls that are in place to try to keep people away from the computer systems and things like that. So lots of times we would have an on-site engagement where we would collect the data before we would travel. You would characterize it and analyze it as best you could. Then you would go and do this engagement to test out and probe where you could. And then you would kind of return home after a week of being kind of on travel. And then essentially you would try to suss out, kind of, identify what you learned from the engagement. Did it collect other data that you then need to characterize and analyze? And essentially then the end product artifact from all of this is a report that helps kind of really detail out kind of essentially what you did, what you saw, what the state of the system is, kind of, your assessment report that gets sent back to the system owner so that they can kind of improve their system by making changes. Lots of times they could use it to submit to higher ups or people that have, maybe their CIO, their chief information officer, or somebody that has the power to maybe make the changes. They could use that report as additional evidence that the changes need to be made. So let me go ahead and jump to just kind of the final summary slide on this overview, and that is that the core basis, the IDART methodology and the diagram you just saw is kind of the core basis for the red teaming work we do. And essentially, it's this framework that's a set of processes, and it's heavily what Sandia uses for its red teaming activities. A big part of it is stimulating creativity, because again, these teams that you want to build, you want a diverse and experienced team members. You don't want just a bunch of computer scientists or cybersecurity experts, network engineers. You need kind of some of everything so they can bring different views to the table and different perspectives. So we really try to have, we weigh heavily diversity in our team. Sometimes we've even had English majors, and we've had other people that sometimes can really look through documentation and understand, oh, I can see how this is interpreted one way, but it's put into practice another way. Just a quick little war story on that. Sometimes you go to these data centers and they have something like these big cooling towers out in front. They kind of look like a big, I don't know, in Indiana, if you have swamp coolers, but out in the West and other places where it's more arid, you tend to have essentially water running over things and essentially it's these cooling towers that help cool these big data centers. And we were on an assessment, and one of our more junior members that was definitely along for more training purposes, as we kind of approached the facility and hadn't even looked at the system yet, he had mentioned just this idea of, hey, if I had a slingshot and a kind of a Tide Pod with Dawn soap, I could kind of slingshot it into those cooling towers and take them down. And the suds would essentially kind of muck with the cooling center. And essentially, once you lose your cooling, then that's essentially like a denial of service attack on a facility, and it could shut the whole thing down. So, those type of perspectives, not everything is necessarily hands-on keyboard, looking at code or, kind of checking switch configurations and things like that. It's very interesting. You never know where you might kind of get a really interesting view that is something to take into consideration. So yeah, one of the other things with this IDART methodology is it's very scalable and flexible. So we've looked at a lot of different information system types, IT systems, OT systems, individual components, large systems of systems, to answer a wide variety of kind of security related questions. So both that help with the design as well as help with kind of operations. So let's see, how am I doing on time? Yeah, it looks like we're about halfway through, so I'll speed up just a little bit more. So as part of the planning here, this is kind of the customer parts of this of the planning. You want to look at system owner needs. So essentially, you're looking at a lot of the security assumptions. You're looking at security design options based on limited budgets. You're looking at how do you do everything from test and train kind of personnel. What are a lot of unintended consequences to the system design? People sometimes don't appreciate that when they make a choice, every time they make a choice, it kind of closes the door somewhere else. And then a lot of it comes down to how to measure improvement of your security in the system. And then a big part of the red teaming, as we mentioned, is exploring security options, trade-offs, technology insertion, stuff like that we mentioned. And it applies to everything from what technology to use, how you implement it, what policies you have in place, what processes and procedures you're using, things of that nature. That can even improve things like training your next, IT sysadmin and things like that. So it's not just, hey, let's switch out this one component for another. So one part of what we have, this table here is part of the kind of IDART process. And essentially there's a number of kind of categories and different types of things that categories that this IDART methodology can be applied to. In the first column there, it has a DA, that's design assurance. This is kind of like a consumer reports kind of viewpoint of essentially how to identify what type of red teaming you want to do based on what you want out of the system. So on the left there, you can see columns of, hey, I want to be able to do something like halfway down, I see identify and describe consequential security design alternatives. So as you can see there, the solid box under the design assurance would be big. So a number of these kind of items here are just different categories that we use and that are different types of red teaming. For example, the PT is pen testing if you wanted to just do a pen testing. Things like G for gaming, O for operational red teaming. So there's a number of different kind of categories that red teaming can fall into. And this diagram and kind of we call it red teaming for project managers. A large view of this, as far as kind of a more expansive view of this, is available kind of on a link I'll give you at the end. But this is used by project managers, and there's a more detailed description of what each of these categories are and kind of what the strengths and weaknesses are and what they give you if you want to kind of do a particular type of red teaming. So a part of it too is when you start on these type of red team activities, you usually have to have a statement of work in place, something that identifies tasks, defines scope, talking about kind of expectations. Hey, my team's going to come in on these dates. We're going to have access. You have things like rules of behavior that you do. You do have kind of essentially, we call it a get out of jail free card, which is essentially a signed contract saying we'll be able to touch these systems in these ways, and you guys know about it, and the right people are aware of it, so that if any surprises happen, essentially we have this document to fall back on that's signed kind of by teams on both sides, by the appropriate management or legal teams on each side. But you also kind of talk about what's in scope, what the schedule is, what the cost factors are, things like that. A lot of this is kind of falls under that project management aspect of it that I was wanting to talk to you guys about, because I do realize I think Purdue is like rated, I saw in one ranking like number 4 in project management, kind of in the business school. And so I do think it touches on maybe some of the strengths that you guys have, or that there might be some interest that you guys would have for this as well. So also some of the statement of work would also talk about descriptions of what those deliverables are going to look like. Is it going to be a report? Is it going to have network topologies? Is there going to be kind of items that are somewhat ranked on criticality of, hey, this is a you must fix now versus this is a minor thing. If it doesn't get fixed, we don't see it as a major concern. These type of things can have inputs into whether or not systems get certified, accredited, things of that nature. So trying to understand that there's sometimes a political kind of side to it too that you have to take into account. So the possible red team deliverables, essentially the artifacts that come out of this kind of process, is there's a lot of narrative talking about, hey, how people are behaving, maybe you should improve your training, adversary models, which are really good, even outside of whatever recommendations you might have. It's like, well, thanks for building us an adversary model. Now we can really understand capabilities that people might have. There's a lot of attack graphs and trees that come out, attack plans, things like that. And then, a final report that really kind of does detail out our findings. So let's see. So as far as the red team project, from a team perspective, once you understand the objectives of the projects, you really want to understand what resources you need kind of from an internal red team, project manager on building the red team to go out and do the work. As I mentioned, we really want to understand the scope, constraints, and logistics, but we also want to understand who do we need on our red team and what skill sets. This is what I mentioned before about this RT4PM, which is going to be, I'll give you the final link there on the final slide of the presentation, where essentially it's a Sandia kind of outward-facing resource that you should be accessible from anybody that can kind of look at this documentation. And if you have questions, Sandia, kind of that's part of our mission, is here to help kind of move it along and help people kind of be able to kind of incorporate this into their processes. So I'm going to go ahead and, just in the interest of time, jump past a couple of these, because I think I've kind of covered for the most part a lot of the idea of developing a project plan, trying to look at what security questions need to be answered. A big thing is trying to understand what's you'll see in a couple of slides here. It's called nightmare consequences. Essentially, it's trying to talk to people, the system owner, and kind of say, hey, what keeps you up at night? What is your nightmare consequence? And that might be, oh, they're going to steal all of our data, or oh, if I have downtime more than 20 minutes, that's a nightmare for me, because I'm a stock trading company and people need high reliability on access. It could be exfiltration of data. It could be loss of reputation. And so understanding that kind of nightmare consequence helps you understand what you're protecting and why. And then, of course, part of that will be trying to understand who the adversary is. So again, the definition of assessment of what you're looking at, it could be networks, applications, hardware, processes, components. Again, IDART kind of is pretty scalable to a wide variety of things. And you're really trying to identify what specific security-related concerns need to be addressed, because, again, you kind of can't protect everything with a limited budget. So you really have to kind of be a little bit more strategic and surgical about what you're trying to protect and why and from whom, essentially. So let me go ahead and just talk about the types of red teaming. This was kind of just a single slide that I kept in here. Again, referring back to those types of red teaming in that one chart. The consumer reports type chart, where there's design assurance, hypothesis testing, red team gaming, behavioral, benchmarking, operational, analytical, and pen testing. These are all different types of red teaming that have different flavors and answer different questions and can accomplish different things, whether it's trying to improve system security or trying to figure out system design. things of that nature. And a lot of red teams will be a hybrid of a few of different ones. So again, getting back to the threat concerns, trying to understand who's attacking you and why. So you're trying to understand your own vulnerabilities and consequences, but who might attack, and the adversary type. Is it an insider? Do I need to worry about that? Is it an external adversary? Is there collusion going on? And then as far as it being an adversary, what's their sophistication? Are they a nation state? Do they have billions of dollars at their disposal? And have they been, can they do it for 10 years because they have time on their side, as opposed to, no, we need to kind of hack into you now because there's a war going on and I need, to take down your electrical infrastructure or something of that nature. So lots of times, the more sophisticated advanced adversaries will have money, time, people, and it could be really a long-term campaign. So you're looking for these adversaries to try to understand the sophistication, what access they have, and what targets they're after, things of that nature. They all help you kind of, again, bound in scope, tighten the scope of what the threat is and what you really need to be protecting against. So again, this idea of nightmare consequences that I talked about earlier, you're looking at system performance, as I mentioned, operation, the public perception, again, kind of that target example I used before. It can hurt quite a bit. There's other things, if somebody like the CDC got hacked into, that could really hurt their credibility. And so a lot of organizations really kind of live and die on credibility and their reputation. And then economic impacts is probably the most obvious one. So you want to really determine if these nightmare consequences are consistent with what the system owner is trying to learn from the assessment. Lots of times system owners say, hey, I just want to be protected against anything. But then once you start having these discussions, you're able to kind of really dial in and focus on what their true concerns are. So you can really start to kind of bound and scope kind of this assessment so that you can be successful. If you don't tend to do that, you'll either end up generating an artifact that is so broad and unapplicable that it doesn't really add a lot of value, or you'll attack, or you'll try to, produce an artifact, your final report and really hyper focus on one area that maybe is not of interest, where it's like, oh, well, thanks for that, but I have, 80% of my network is outside of what you really dialed in on. So really trying to talk to the sponsor, customer, system owner about what their nightmare consequence is, and then identify what the threat is, what the potential adversary is that they're trying to protect against, really helps you kind of come out in the end with good project management and good kind of a good product to make sure that you're red teaming the right thing. So quantifications of metrics. This is some examples I told you before. You're looking at, hey, what's going on here? What really is considered a nightmare kind of consequence? Is it loss of life, interruptions, degradations, public image, loss of money, liability, that type of thing. And then again, this is all just about constraining the project, the scope, as far as kind of like how in depth you're going to do, what boundaries you're looking at. Maybe I can look at these subnets and not those. You're trying to kind of, again, as I mentioned before, put guardrails on kind of the scope of what the red team is like. And then, identify the threat and then try to understand what the budget is. A lot of this is program management type stuff that I'm going to kind of just jump through here to just get to the next kind of stage that I want to. So summary here is there's a lot more than just kind of beating on a system and trying to do pen tests where you're trying to hack and find your way in a system. It's a lot more about system understanding, trying to understand the threat, trying to understand kind of the system owner's concerns and operational mission to try to make sure that that kind of is always up and running. If you can hack into a system and great, I got in, but I got into a place that's pretty obscure and doesn't really have an impact on the system, that doesn't get you much. So you really want to make sure that you're kind of protecting the system and adding some value to the system. So, and again, you'll almost always have incomplete information in the data you collect. There's always going to be some unknown. You never have a perfect picture, and it's always changing. Systems all the time are always changing. And lots of times to think, especially from a project management point of view, is that things take longer and cost more than you think. And then you want to consider dependencies that are out of your control. There might be stuff that you just can't fix, and then you just have to learn or try to identify mitigations that can help mitigate kind of a threat. And then again, as I mentioned before, a big part of this red teaming, purple teaming is maintaining good communications with system owners so that they're on good terms with you and willing to share as much information about the system as you can. So that kind of all is summed up in just this idea that projects aren't always what they seem. There's scope creep. There's things that look one way end up, once you get into them, always kind of end up being something else. So there's kind of that military adage of, once you kind of get boots on the ground, any plan kind of just evaporates and you got to be able to kind of deal with it. But it's always good to have a plan. So with that, I'm going to jump into the data collection. So the purpose of data collection, as you recall, we did the planning and now we're kind of in that loop, the IDART loop there where we talk about data collection. And we're trying to figure out, get what we can about the target, the environment, its history, the behavior, what the culture is. And so we're trying to understand kind of the main mission And we're trying to understand the design and architecture and interfaces of an operational system. And then as you kind of can tie in the nightmares and the consequences, kind of the worst case scenario and the threat, you're able to kind of then really start to kind of make sense with the data. So here's just a few quick examples of like physical and virtual of different types of data collections that you can do. There's virtual and physical sources. So like think security documents, requirements, policies, procedures, things like that, network diagrams, topologies, device configurations, even websites like social media, phone lists and org charts. There's all kinds of code repositories. It depends on the system that you're looking at, how much time you have, and from a red team perspective, there's just a wide variety of things that you could be looking at to understand the system, the organization, the organizational culture, and everything like that that comes into play when how a system operates. You can collect from people. This is kind of that. This is not necessarily social engineering. That's something you do to get in. This is more just a source where you can collect data from. You can kind of think to talk about system designers, the IT administrators, the users, security people, owners, everybody. These are all the different types of people that you can think to talk to try to get, again, additional information on how not just it's designed, but how it's used to, as I mentioned before, kind of understand if there's problems in the seams or the handoff of that information. There's site visits, as I mentioned, if you can actually be there. One quick little story here. I visited my wife's school. She's an elementary school teacher, and they have a server room that is also doubles as the teacher's refrigerator lunchroom. So a site visit there would show you something that maybe would not have showed up on a document, a design documentation that everybody has access to a server room, which is would be a finding that you would have in a red team kind of final report. So things that examples like that I think really help to articulate where site visits or looking at diagrams, blueprints, design blueprints can also be of use. There's software-specific information sources. Again, sometimes you do these red teaming not necessarily on a hardware component or a large system. You might be doing it on an application. And so in that context, looking at entry points, data interface exchanges, APIs, looking at a lot of these types of things and then comparing against, requirements documents and things like that, trying to understand, is it implemented, how it's documented, is it well understood? And then, so data collection tips for collecting data is essentially that you want to start as early as possible, trying to have these conversations as early as you can in the process. You don't want to be doing it kind of last minute as you're throwing your report together because it's pivotal. It's a key component that goes into the analysis. You want to be cooperative. The more you can kind of get out of people and get them to kind of relax. And if they're, if their superior or advisor is not in the room, they might kind of get real with you and can kind of tell you, oh yeah, we're supposed to do that, but we don't. We kind of short circuit that process here. Don't quite follow what we're supposed to do there. And so that kind of gives you some additional information, but that needs to be a safe space where they know that you're not going to just call them out kind of in the final report, but you can kind of say, hey, you might want to look into some of these there's concerns that maybe some of the processes aren't being followed. And essentially, you want to validate whenever possible the documentation you receive, either off of actual being on the system and doing in-map scans or whatever, or looking through actual network topologies. You want to validate it if you can against real-world operations. So a summary is data collection is essentially essential to be able to do attacks and brainstorming. And you want to be able to kind of, there's a lot of different sources of information, and a lot of what you have is sparse and incomplete. And so you're kind of having to make the best judgment you can based on kind of expertise and years of experience based on kind of incomplete data. So that was kind of the data collection. Now we're moving into characterization. So characterization is now once you have the data, you need to kind of really start to understand what the data means. And you kind of do a lot of that through viewpoints. So for example, you have a target system, but you want to take into account all of these different things. You want to kind of be able to understand what the history is and configuration and human behaviors and things like that. So here's a set of a few different viewpoints that we have. This is just from a number of different systems. Here's examples of different ways to kind of visualize how a system might be set up. This is just block diagram telling you of all the different kind of components that might be associated with one system in particular. Here is a set of network diagrams, topologies that help you understand, hey, where's the switch? What's the routing look like? Do I have a demilitarized zone? Do I have a safe zone that's kind of trying to protect the open internet from a corporate network? Things like that. This could also help you understand, are all of my firewalls using the same vendor? If there's a 0 day, I'm host, whereas if you maybe start to have non-homogeneous component, non-homogeneous components, you can start to have protections layered in that way. But then there's trade-offs, as I mentioned, with technology insertion. It's like, okay, that means more training. People have to understand and have different skill sets to be able to kind of use different types of network appliances. So that, there's examples in these trade-offs where the best security design might be limited by real life and operational, the nature of operations, to where there just might be limitations on implementing kind of some solutions. There's logical and functional views. This kind of shows things such as how components are related to each other. There's process diagrams and things of that nature. So there's a number of different views here. Here's a spatial physical view. This is, a substation transformer and electrical grid, kind of just showing you distances. If you're wondering about kind of physical intrusion to supplement a cyber attack. Here's a physical view example here. There's in the upper left, there's a comms closet there that is kind of next to a server room and next to kind of just an open access child development center. So some of these kind of diagrams can help in a number of different ways. There's temporal views. This is a good example here. You see a chart, and just at a high level, there's showing a backup between a facility where essentially there's two facilities associated with an organization, and they back up to each other's sites at the same time at 11 p.m. at night. And so you can see this FTP traffic kind of skyrocket. So by seeing this view, you can see, okay, as an adversary, I can see maybe that, this is when you do your backups. I'm able to kind of get through, kind of secondary sources, kind of find out what's going on. And then there's life cycle supply chain views. You're trying to understand where things come from and what process they go through and who touches them, and at what point you lose kind of chain of custody. That's a big thing that, if anybody's familiar with like the SolarWinds attack and other things, lots of times, the vendors that are outside of your control, a chip may show up at your doorstep and it's already been compromised before you even put it into a highly secure and red teamed environment. And then there's consequence views. This has kind of and or gates here. It's essentially just and or decisions of a tree where you have kind of a final consequence or a goal at the end that an adversary is maybe trying to get to, and it's kind of showing you what needs to happen to get to that goal. So there's just different views. Auto-generated views, lots of times we'll do things where we run like Nmap scans, and we essentially can then auto-generate diagrams that help you know and understand connectivity of what servers are connected through a router to others, what ports are active, things like that. So, taking the data, and we have a lot of tools where we can kind of like take data, and this is kind of an exploding area using machine learning and things like that, where they can kind of auto-generate views based on kind of the linear data or the tabular data that might exist in a database somewhere. So, essentially dependencies can be derived from views. That's where you really get to kind of see how a system is set up. And it's just like graph theory and mathematics. Being able to put things on a graph really can help from a human perspective understand the connectivity and how things are kind of the assumptions. It can tease out kind of maybe assumptions and ground truth. So again, critical success factors for security tend to be kind of administrative procedures are defined and followed. There's security guidelines. Things are basically defined and followed. But there's a number of different. This list is probably there's probably a list of thousands of things that you could add to this, essentially about what are good best practices. Views just kind of validate the red team understanding of the data they collected. So getting back to this, we've done plan, data collection. The rest of this will go pretty fast here. It looks like we have just a couple minutes left, but so for one of the things that we do is we also build adversary models. So once an adversary maybe has been identified, we want to try to figure out what the threat level is with an adversary, and to kind of put a name to an adversary, like, oh, it's a Russian hacking kind of group. That doesn't help us because sometimes there's some emotional baggage that comes with that. Sometimes if their capabilities change, it doesn't help. So we really want to try to kind of put things into a generic cyber security kind of adversary model. And we do that by kind of looking at a number of different metrics. As I mentioned at the introduction, there's intensity and stealth and time. Of the adversary, and then their resources. How technical are they? What is their knowledge, and what is their access? And so essentially these are just a set of slides that kind of give a high, medium, low for each of these categories. The intensity of, are they willing to lose life over it? Is it like a terrorist eco group that's really willing to kind of be known and they don't care about stealth? Which is this next one here, which is talking about, if they're just going to brute force their way in, and they don't have to be stealthy, then that makes them a higher threat in this category. So there's these three categories. And again, the time that I mentioned before about it, if you have a lot more time, then it gives you a lot more opportunity. And then again, if you have a lot more people, if you have a lot more knowledge, and if you have a lot more access, essentially you can take these things and build this kind of heat map threat profile that we have here, where essentially if you are kind of high in all those categories, you're a nation state, we call it, which would be somebody that, has, millions to billions of dollars and decades at their disposal, and they're highly motivated. That would be a high threat level here. Whereas if you look kind of in the bottom levels where you see maybe people don't have any of that, and it's just maybe a teen hacker in his mom's basement, then maybe that threat level would be an 8, where it's a little bit more kind of instantaneous. You put days to weeks into something to try to see if you could hack in, and now you've kind of identified, okay, what is this threat? And based on that threat, you can decide how much money you want to invest, or at what level their capabilities are that you need to protect against. So again, the summary is naming adversaries came with some different interpretations and some emotional baggage, and kind of maybe an idea kind of they're with naming an adversary. There's a lot of assumptions that come with that we found in our red teams people might have different definitions of and different impressions of. So by kind of having a little bit more of a metric to this, now it kind of level sets everybody to kind of understand that we're all talking what we're talking about. So again, red teaming, there's just, I think, 2 or 3 slides here about thinking like a bad guy. A big part of red teaming is you're not trying to kind of worry about, oh, wait a minute, I need to go fix that bug, I need to do this. You're a little bit more like slash and burn in some of these kind of things, of where you really are trying to, you want to kind of think like a bad guy, where you're really trying to kind of corrupt the information or steal it. You're trying to understand what you're doing, and you don't want to necessarily be bound by the design constraints of how a system's supposed to work. You're really trying to break out of that box and kind of think, oh, how could I really mess with this thing? The 9/11, we're on the anniversary here of 9/11. And, that is a good example of, using a plane to take out a building. Who had thought about that? Kind of this idea of I'm not going to follow by your rules, and you can put up kind of all of the locks and fences that you want. But, if there's another way, I don't have to necessarily fall under your paradigm. So let's see, I'll go ahead and just kind of, these are some of the different types of attacks and adversaries that you might run into. There's a few sets that I think I've kind of covered so far, so I'll jump past that. But yeah, the best red teamers are able to kind of think like a bad guy and not just kind of be total rule followers, but think, how can you break the rules, or how can I get around this without even breaking a rule that you haven't even defined? So yeah, developers and defenders think about fixes. That's not what a red teamer is supposed to be thinking about. And it's a lot of it is, it's a learned kind of acquired taste, because you have to learn to kind of work beyond your comfort level. So the analysis, I'm just going to jump through the analysis real quick. Basically, security is often added. This is what I mentioned after the fact. It's kind of bolted on. And so here's a few examples. Bypassability. Here's an example of where you have a gate, but it wasn't thought that you could crawl under it. There's spoofing, as I think a lot of you, if you're in kind of the computer science, computer engineering area, might be familiar. Cybersecurity area might be familiar with that. There's denial. Hey, if I can just break the lock, the key off in the lock, it keeps, I don't get access, but I keep you from getting access. And that might be your goal. Over here is a fence that, it's like you might have the strongest lock, but if I can take it off on the hinges. And then latency is a big thing. That Target example that I gave, they had all the cybersecurity there in place and it was working. They just didn't respond for 2 weeks. And so lots of times latency is a big part of trying to kind of prevent somebody from stealing something and running away with it. If you can slow them down enough, then you can kind of help, identify them and then stop them. Here's an example of this picture I love, because it's got, it's got the vehicle barrier there that goes up and down the arm, but you can just see the pattern of everybody driving around it because they didn't want to mess with it, because there's no fence beyond it. But yeah, so, a number of different ways of thinking, around kind of designs. And there's human resources too. This is the social engineering I alluded to earlier. There's just a large kind of variety of actions that you can take from that respect as well. So identifying attack vectors, essentially the big part of the IDART methodology is brainstorming. You kind of get a lot of people together and you try to kind of whiteboard out all the different attack paths to a goal. And so there's a slide up here and a couple that I'm going to jump to that kind of just shows some of that. So we go through this brainstorming where we basically get butcher paper, Post-it pads. You get in a room with the red team, with your team. You already have some data on the system. You know some network topologies. You know enough about the mission of how it's supposed to operate. And you basically kind of brainstorm where you go through and you kind of put a bunch of Post-it notes like on a whiteboard. So this is an example here of where, you can try to build these trees and graphs where you can kind of see what paths might get you to your end goal. And so that's a lot of kind of a part of this methodology that we follow. And there's there's like a week-long course where we do training for government entities and other kind of people in academia and partners, where everything I'm telling you here is kind of in much more detail over the course of a week. So essentially, you're just trying to look for ways to achieve that nightmare consequence by going through this brainstorming kind of process. So the final slide here, a couple of slides, is on reporting. So once you've kind of done all that, we've gone through the characterization, analysis, all these viewpoints that I talked about, and then you're looking to generate the report. So report, typically, this is what our reports tend to look like. You have an introduction and executive summary for people that are the system owners, the people that can do something about it, of high level of what your findings were. But then you tend to have a target system description. Hey, this is a network. It has these components in it. You might have a diagram. And then basically you can kind of some discussion of it, of the security posture. And then you do kind of reiterate what the adversary definition and goals are, what your analysis was, what the results are, which is usually different than the analysis. It's usually more like, hey, here's our findings. Here's the strengths. Here's kind of a category 1 finding. You got to fix this right away. Here's the category 5 finding. It's not so bad. And then here's your strengths. Make sure you keep them, stuff like that. And then conclusions. And then most of our reports are, it's like, our reports tend to be 20 to 30 pages, but then another 150 pages of like in-map, dumps and diagrams and things like that of our technical tools. So yeah, typically we want to kind of report on critical success factors and characterizing kind of our views. We'll have a lot of those views. We'll talk about the strengths and weaknesses, talk about some of the attacks that we've identified, and then basically kind of the final results. So we're very good and meticulous about documenting it as we go along. So you're not trying to remember, oh, I was on site and I talked to that guy, but I don't remember what he said. And then essentially the appendices, as I mentioned, that's where we have a lot of kind of the more in-depth stuff, as well as kind of the associated things like the rules of engagement and other things. So there's a lot of kind of other stuff out there online about red team. That's something that over the last couple of decades has gotten quite a bit more kind of mature, and so you can find more and more on it. This methodology is a NIST approved kind of methodology that NIST has kind of embraced. And essentially, you just really want to understand how to improve your system design and security. So I think, and it helps you kind of identify what the low-hanging fruit is and what some of the easier stuff to fix would be and what's costlier, and make those trade-offs. So the reports and the IDART methodology, this red teaming methodology, really helps you kind of get at trying to make some hard decisions about where to kind of spend your limited budget to improve a system based on a risk, based on an adversary, and based on a nightmare consequence that you have. So let me jump to, I think this is the last slide here. Yeah, so basically, you really want to kind of, predominantly the use case that this has been applied the most to is in the assurance of a design and system, even though there are some other, like I mentioned, the tabletop and some of the other things. Lots of times this is used, that's in that name, IDART, is the design assurance, is kind of its main use case that we have. So this is the final slide that just has this link here. And if you go to this casa.sandia.gov, so IDART has recently been rebranded as CASA. And so cyber assessment security. So if you go there, you can find all these materials. You can find kind of some of the handouts and other stuff, a lot more information as well. So with that, I think we are just about at time. Are there any questions?
Yeah, thank you, Russell, for the really interesting talk. I think we have a few questions. So one question is from Andrew. Andrew says that any horror stories about needing the get out of jail free card, aka Darknet Diaries?
Luckily, we haven't needed any because Sandia does have a substantial legal team that kind of keeps us out of trouble, and we tend to be, especially as a national lab, we tend to be very risk adverse. But yeah, I have read a lot of stories about people that are doing, red team assessments for, judicial court system, and they didn't tell the right people and didn't have the right legal documents in place, and it can kind of lead to some headaches, if not jail time for some people. So yeah, as part of that project management scope of it, it's really important to kind of make sure that you have the right legal documents.
Yeah, I want to squeeze one question on my own. So basically, I know you talked about zero-day vulnerabilities, but we know for at least the research that I do for 5G or these sort of systems, there are some known issues that take a lot of time to fix. So do you guys consider those when you look into assessment and those sort of scenarios?
We do, yeah. And some of the scenarios, some of the sponsors that we've engaged with are government entities that sometimes a lot of the government budgets go year to year, but yeah, sometimes some of the fixes are fundamental. And that's all kind of then discussing with the system owner what their appetite is for trying to fix something versus trying to just create other mitigations for it. For example, it's like if it might be too big of a fix or a long-term fix, fundamentally you can say this is a problem, and sometimes it depends on how. Again, you kind of have that orthogonal graph of likelihood versus cost of it happening. And so sometimes you have to take that into account of saying, okay, it's not very likely, but the cost, it's going to hurt you really big versus it happens all the time, but the cost is low. So yeah, we have come across that on some of the assessments that we've done of where there are fundamental changes. And as you would expect, more often than not, people are like, well, I don't have the budget for that. But the whole idea of generating this report and having that executive summary and being able to have that, especially working with the government that Sandia does, where we support government departments and agencies in the interest of national security, those reports can at least be used then to kind of go up the chain of authority to then get high enough up that somebody can at least, have understanding that, hey, this is kind of a problem that's been reported up. But yeah, that is kind of an ongoing issue. And lots of time, more often than not, it's the solution is, hey, how can we mitigate this problem and accept the risk? And that can get into the whole fields that you probably get in project management of risk management and things of that nature. So yeah, it's really about trying to, the red team is really just about trying to put it out there of saying, hey, here's the problem as I see it. I may not even know the full cost monetarily. I can tell you it's going to be big to redesign your whole system, but this is what's needed and sometimes in some of the recommendations that we give in our red team reports, we may say, hey, here's a recommendation that you can do now to try to fix it, or maybe the recommendation is this is so bad you should take this offline right now and maybe look for an alternative way to still meet your mission. But yeah. So there's a lot of that thought process, and a lot of that comes down to kind of building the right team that has the right experience to kind of be able to know enough that I'm not just a network engineer, but I've seen enough networks and I've seen enough fixes. Maybe I was on a network defender for a while, that I can kind of give some advice on what those recommendations might be to mitigate a risk or to kind of remove it entirely.
Yeah,
yeah,
I think
it's hard.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. At least the vulnerability reportings that we do, it takes like few years to go through the process of the spec. Suppose I report something to Qualcomm will say that you have to talk to 3GPP because if they don't change the protocol, I cannot do anything. So
Yeah.
there are a lot of things that are lying around. I think we have time for one more question. So this is a really good question from Jimmy. Jimmy says, what role do you see AI playing in the future of cybersecurity, especially automated systems or detecting, responding to attacks?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question, and we're starting to see that play out quite a bit. I mean, just from an easy kind of identifiable answer to that is, if you're trying to build these playbooks and you're trying to kind of build these automated capabilities to go through and scan networks and subnetworks, if you can know those ahead of time before you actually get on the network, you can kind of map out and through an automated fashion script out basically all of the in-map scans that might take days to do and have them work and collect the data. From an AI perspective, you can start doing more and more kind of in the moment learning and pivoting and decision making. There's also this idea known as CAML, counter adversary machine learning, where essentially you're looking at ideas of if somebody builds an AI model, what are the weaknesses of that model itself? And so doing red teaming on AI models itself. And that's a growing area of research we've seen starting in academia. You're starting to see papers come out in that as well. So, it's always this cat and mouse game between I've got a system, now I need to try to kind of protect it. I'm going to develop tools. I'll automate those tools. And then maybe I can even, bring into account red teaming to kind of do more and more pen testing and kind of just anything that you can kind of automate and script. You could start to kind of give some intelligence and some machine learning of if you have the large enough data sets of what to do in what situation. But what's even more interesting is the next step beyond that is, hey, what about the AI models themselves? If you start becoming dependent on that, that becomes a weakness, that becomes part of your attack surface. and everything else. But yeah, we've seen kind of, more and more industry starting to use AI, whether it's in manufacturing or whether it's in just data gathering of more and more. If you look at a lot of companies that gather user data and credit card usage and all that stuff, the AI models are starting to kind of really be able to kind of dial in on human behavior and kind of start to predict things. And so that's where I have started to see it in the world of red teaming and pen testing, where people are kind of applying it there, just like you see it in code generation and other areas as well. But it is an area that's being a little bit more stubborn to break through, because a big part of cybersecurity is very creative. It's very much understanding no system, rarely do two systems look alike. And lots of times the decisions, if you make the wrong decision, you have to understand your goals. Am I trying to keep my stealth? Am I trying to, what is my, it starts to get complicated. The solution space blows up fast. So it's an area that's proven a little more stubborn compared to others that are more easily, have an easier entry into AI usage, in industry. But yeah, great question.
Yeah, I think we are running out of time. Let's thank our speaker. Thank you, Russell, for the really nice talk. It was really nice meeting you, talking to you.
Yeah, thank you. It was great having me. It was great to have me. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. It was great to talk in this venue, and it was. I'm glad to share this information. I'm always happy to kind of answer questions and help people kind of improve their red teaming kind of capabilities and help kind of teach the methodology that I hope that can further kind of secure systems. That's a big part of what we do and why we do the job we do. So thank you so much for having me.
Great. Thanks a lot, Russell. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Russell.